From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us for Face the State on this Sunday. We are on assignment, as it were. We are at Yellowstone Forever on the gates of Yellowstone National Park, just outside of Gardner. Here is where we are. Joining us this morning, John Shear from our MTN station in Bozeman. John, but our special guest this morning, Dan Wenk. Dan, this is going to air on Sunday. We're chatting with you today, but officially, by the time this our folks get a chance to see this, you will be the former superintendent of this beautiful land behind us. Tell me how that feels right now as we're facing the end of this time for you, Dan.
Actually, in many ways, it doesn't feel real.
Mm-hmm.
This is a place I love. Mm-hmm. It's a place that I've been able to call home for about 13 of my years of my career with the National Park Service. It's a place where I raised 2 of my 3 children were born when I worked in Yellowstone National Park, and it's a place that I've had the opportunity to share with many, many people, and probably also because it's a work that's never done. You can never say that everything you wanted to do when you were the superintendent of Yellowstone you've accomplished. So I'm comfortable with the retirement that's going to be on the 29th. But it's not quite feeling real.
Let's talk about, just briefly, let's talk about some of those things. You said it's never accomplished, it's never done. Let's talk about some of the things that were done while you were here, Dan. Some of those things that you're proud of.
Well, I think Yellowstone is it's such an important place, not just to visitors who come here, but it's such an important place to the whole ethic of public lands and conservation and preservation and visitor use and visitor enjoyment. And what we've been able to do throughout the history of Yellowstone, first of all, and that a legacy that I've been able to carry on is first and foremost preservation of this place. And you know, there's a legacy of incredible superintendents, whether they were military superintendents or civilian superintendents, that goes back to 1872 when the park was established. And this is still probably the greatest wildlife display, you know, in the lower 48. It's home to half the world's geysers, over 10,000 thermal features. It is a place that I think you can get a glimpse of primitive America. You can see bison herds in the middle of the Lamar Valley that probably are reminiscent of what it looked like when settlers were coming across the United States and the area was being explored for the first time. Old Faithful is still faithful. You know, we have this summer, Steamboat Geyser has erupted now 20 times. It went again this morning. And it happened once before in its history where we've had that kind of thing. We've had some opportunities to improve the concession facilities in the park with new facilities at Canyon Village, with redoing, you know, new visitor facilities in terms of kitchens and restaurants to take care of the ever-increasing numbers of people that have come here. We're building new roads or redoing the roads that we have in Yellowstone to accommodate traffic today. The canyon trails and overlooks are something that if people haven't seen as we're opening those up are something that will serve Yellowstone well for the next 50 to 100 years.
Dan, we spoke last spring about the things that you wanted to accomplish before you left. And I believe those things were infrastructure, bison management, and people management. How would you like to see those things handled after you've left?
You know, I think that I think that new superintendents or new leadership that comes into the park, it never comes into looking to say, this is what I'm going to change. They look at these things and they look at, you know, where are we going, what path we're on, and really how can I help us get there. No superintendent sets these goals independently. So when we're talking about wildlife management, whether it be grizzly bear management or bison management or elk or native fish conservation, we're on a course. Now, I made adjustments when I came here that I thought were necessary. The next leadership will come in and make some adjustments, but the ultimate goal is the same. The ultimate goal is preservation of species and basically making sure that wild animals and wildlife can be wild animals and wildlife. When we look at infrastructure, we've done a lot. And you know, we put some new contracts in place in my tenure here, and we've had over $200 million of investment by Xanterra and and lodging and restaurants and gift shops. And we're just about to enter into a new short-term contract with Delaware North on the stores that's going to also continue to improve those facilities for visitors. And so those opportunities are, there's a course that's in place. My expectation is the next Cam Shally, as the next superintendent when he comes in, will look at those. He'll make adjustments that he feels are necessary, but the ultimate goal is the same, and that is preservation of Yellowstone and providing for the visitor use and enjoyment of the park.
Can we talk a little bit about bison? I know you've had a special interest in bison, and one of the things you've been working on is the ability to take some Yellowstone bison and move them elsewhere. How's that going, and what are your hopes for the future?
When I found out I was leaving, one of the biggest concerns I had was making sure that that was completed before I left. We're not where I wanted to be. We had two agreements that we needed to enter into. One with the state and APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, in terms of how we would care for bison or put bison through quarantine in Yellowstone National Park at Stevens Creek. That agreement is in place and we're up and running. We have an approved quarantine facility. The second agreement was agreement between Yellowstone National Park and the National Park Service, APHIS, and the state, but also the tribes at Fort Peck. We've not been able to finish that agreement yet. We were hopeful earlier this summer that we would get it in place and be able to move bison by the end of this calendar year. I think there's a possibility a few bison might be able to be moved, but in order to get have the pipeline that would move bison from Yellowstone to Fort Peck, we're not there yet. I anticipate that that's an agreement that will be in place over the next few months. It needs to be there. The tribes at Fort Peck are ready. They're anxious to receive bison from Yellowstone. We have some protocols that we have to continue to negotiate with APHIS and the state in order to make sure that that happens, and it happens well.
And why do you feel that's so important for the park?
Well, it's important for the park because right now bison are probably the most controversial species that we're dealing with in terms of how we're managing bison in Yellowstone. And as you know, every spring right now we're removing somewhere 700 to 1,000 basically bison are removed because of the need to maintain a population. That population is maintained in a few ways. One is state hunt, but also more importantly a tribal and treaty hunt that takes place outside of the park. The other way is that we capture bison, we transfer them to Native American tribes, and they ship to slaughter, and they use those bison for cultural and nutritional purposes. We need the third leg of that stool, if you will. We need the opportunity to take bison from Yellowstone, which are the last large population of genetically pure, free-ranging bison that have been subjected to all the natural elements. And those bison are important not only to the population of bison, but to Native American tribes. And having that tool that we can use to take bison, put them through a quarantine process, get them to tribal lands, then ultimately to other tribal lands and public lands, I think is very, very important for the long-term conservation of bison.
You mentioned bison being one of the more controversial animals you're dealing with. I'd say the other one is lining up to get into the gate as we speak right behind us. I know that you mentioned your 13 years here, you've had a chance to see Yellowstone in a couple of different phases over quite a long period of time. Where do you see that going, Dan? Because that's going to be the big challenge. We've talked about it before. How do you handle the ever-increasing number of people going through your gates every day?
Well, it is, as I've said, is the least studied species in Yellowstone National Park is the human. And we're changing that. I mean, we have a social science program in Yellowstone right now where we're trying to understand the impact of the level of visitation we have on visitor experience. I mean, how does that affect people's ability to experience the park, their visitor enjoyment, their being able to see all the features and the things they want to take advantage of. But also, how does the level of visitation affect the resources that we're here to protect? And so we have embarked, I think, on an appropriate and ambitious program. We started with some visitor surveys 2 years ago. This past summer, we surveyed 1 week per month throughout the entire season, trying to understand all the different levels of visitation and how that affected the visitor experience and the resources. We have more work to do. I believe that we will have to manage visitor uses. use. We cannot continue to increase at about a 3 to 4% year-over-year increase in visitation. That'll put us in a place where Yellowstone will be probably a big traffic jam most of the time during the peak season. During the peak season, we have about 35,000 visitors a day. I don't know what the right number is, but I do think ultimately we are going to have to limit visitation to Yellowstone. And I also know we can't do that unless we have the science in place to understand exactly what is the right number, what's the impact on the resources, visitor experience, but also what's the impact on the surrounding communities and states.
The interesting thing with that, though, is yes, you've got to have the science, yes, you have to do the research, but while that's happening, those numbers continue to increase. Is there a risk in that if we take this out too long? I mean, can you overstudy this problem, or is there something that has to happen and then continue to do the study?
I don't know that you can overstudy it, but you can take too long to make decisions. I think that we proved, unfortunately, with winter use and winter use management, that we spent about 15 years trying to come up with the right number. And what we obviously showed ourselves is you can't make those decisions without having the science in order to which to base the decisions, because you won't have a decision that will last or be a sustainable decision. Because we learned that lesson, we're trying to get the science right. We're trying to make sure we have informed decisions, decisions that we can stand behind and back up, decisions that we can basically show people why it's the right decision and they should support this, because there's not a community in the ecosystem. There's not a governor in the surrounding states or state legislator that want to see us basically do something that's going to destroy this place, this experience, and destroy the opportunity for people to come and enjoy it. It's an economic powerhouse, you know, for Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. And I think they appreciate that, and I think they also know they need to stand behind making sure, first and foremost, we protect Yellowstone.
I know that that research that's been going on since this spring is not completely collated yet, but are there any tidbits that you have for us from it? Have you learned anything yet?
If we would be having this interview in about 3 hours, I could probably give you a better answer, but I'm having a brief from the research team in about 3 hours today. That's going to give me some of the early results from that work. What we have, we're down in visitation a little bit this year overall. However, September, when we came down this morning, you saw the gates going in. We're 2 lines backed up, and this is September 24th. I mean, September's the new August for visitation. October's the new September. The numbers of people who are coming continue to increase, and they're having a great experience, and that's a wonderful thing.
Any anecdotal information you get out? I know of once in a while. Have you spoken to people? What are they putting in your ear? You know,
I think the biggest problem that we have is congestion. I mean, it's people who go to this summer. Norris Geyser Basin has been inundated with visitors because Steamboat Geyser has gone off 20 times. It went off this morning at 5:18. Probably the parking lot was not full at 5:18 this morning, but that's maybe the only time today that's not going to be full, because the steam phase is going to be going. So I think that people have an expectation that it's going to be crowded. I think they're relatively tolerant. Some of the surveys we did in previous years, 84% of the people still had a good to great visit, coming to Yellowstone. I think they're starting to expect the kind of congestion that we have. And the question is, how much what's the breaking point, and where does that become too much? Last year, the day after the eclipse, Yellowstone was in many ways almost empty in August. I think it was 21st or 20th, whatever day the eclipse was. But the day after, we had the largest crowds Yellowstone had ever seen. And what that told me is that the capacity in this ecosystem for people to stay, whether it be in hotels, campgrounds, or with friends or whatever, is far greater than we see in visitation today. And we basically gridlocked Yellowstone National Park the day after the eclipse. That told me we have to make decisions, and we have to do things proactively that are going to put us in a situation where this is a desired bucket list destination for not just people in America, but for people around the world.
Do you lean one way or another toward plans that you think would work better than others?
You know, everybody has a solution. I will only say right now, I think we're going to have limits to visitation. I don't think those limits are on a yearly basis. I think those limits are peak day visitation. People talk about shuttle systems. I think they need to be explored and looked at. People talk about just caps on how many people can visit in an hour or come into the gates per hour, which would distribute the visitors over a greater period of the day. Other people talk about reservations in terms of you have to have a reservation to get in the park. I don't know which of those will work. I know that all of them are worth looking at, and probably many more things that we're not thinking about, but that's what's going to come out in some of the studies we're doing, and we're trying to engage some of the best thinkers about this that have been dealing with visitation, not just in Yellowstone, but at other national parks and public areas throughout the country.
Here we are sitting at the end of your term as superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. You'd worked here before, now you're back as the superintendent of that. Anything surprise you when you had a little time to sit in that office up there at Mammoth Hot Springs about the position, about being superintendent of this park?
I think probably the biggest thing I felt, I'm not sure it was a surprise, maybe it was a surprise how much I felt it. There's probably not a day that goes by where you don't think to yourself, let's not screw this up. And one of the great things that when I say we, I have a great staff. I have some of the best people who maintain these facilities, who deliver programs to visitors, who do the research, on wildlife biology, ecology, public relations staff, administrative staff, et cetera. I can't say enough about how good they are and the kind of advice they provide. But what I also would say is, at the end of the day, it comes down to somebody has to make a decision. And you feel the weight of this place. And I think that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. You know that the decisions you make today are affecting the future in 5 years or 50 years, for lifetimes to come. And it's a great responsibility. It's one I relished, but I'm not sure I understood how much you would feel it, if you will, in the day-to-day decisions that you make. You
take that with you then. That's going to go with you. You're not leaving that behind then.
Well, somebody else gets to make those decisions. And you take with you, I hope what I take with me is when I come back and visit in 5 or 10 years, that I can see I worried about that, and that was the right decision. I hope what I don't see is, man, I wish I would have done something different there.
We're sitting on the front porch of Yellowstone Forever here, just outside of the gate to the park, the arch. There's a really strong public-private partnership between Yellowstone Forever and the park. How important is that?
We couldn't do it without them. One of the things that Yellowstone Forever brings is it brings the support of the private sector, to Yellowstone, and they do a great job of basically initiating people to Yellowstone and how they can become partners with Yellowstone, to an incredible cadre of individuals that support Yellowstone with their work, but also their wealth, and they support financially Yellowstone National Park, and we can bring to them projects, and those projects can be bricks and mortar, like we're looking to build a new youth campus, or we're just completing the work at Canyon Trails and Overlooks. But it's also about programs, and they support wildlife management programs. They support the ranger programs. They support the interpretive programs, and we try very, very hard to make sure that what they're doing is not supporting the basic needs of Yellowstone National Park, but what they're supporting is things that we cannot do with federal dollars. This past year, we have government appropriations. We have the largest budget of a park in the national park system, of about $35 million of appropriated dollars. But just in terms of the operations of Yellowstone, it's more than double that is what we spend. And that comes from earned revenue, entrance fees, fish fees, utility fees, et cetera, to our concessionaires. But a big portion of that is the dollars that are raised by Yellowstone Forever. And truly, the board meeting is this week, and one of my biggest messages to them is, we couldn't do it without you. Your support is so critical to the preservation and visitor enjoyment of Yellowstone. We can't do it without you. Yellowstone, if you count all the numbers and all the ways, probably has $1 billion worth of deferred maintenance backlog. Most of that is in roads. And we need that work done. And, we need that kind of support for Yellowstone to make sure that we are doing the things we can do to both protect the park and to provide the visitor experience.
It's an interesting dilemma. You're talking about the opportunity to make a lot of money here. I mean, there are proposals out there. John and I were chatting about it earlier about what about hunting in the park? What about different things like that that are being discussed all the time in the park? There's a risk in all of that, though. You lose that four-letter word at the end of Yellowstone National Park if you do some of that. Is there a gray area in that, Dan, where you have to be careful with what happens with all of that?
There's no gray area at all. Mm-hmm. Hunting will not be allowed in Yellowstone National Park. Mm-hmm. It's basically the law that established Yellowstone National Park is protecting the wildlife in the park, and it's against the mission of Yellowstone National Park. There are opportunities for wildlife management by hunting outside of the park, and they are employed by the states of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And we are in active discussions always with them about how those programs are implemented, and I think it's appropriate and it's the right place to be. But the mission of Yellowstone National Park in terms of protecting this place for the benefit and enjoyment of the people includes wildlife, includes the geysers, it includes the ecology of Yellowstone National Park. It includes trying to restore native fisheries and remove the non-natives. We've restored wolves at the Yellowstone National Park from the mid-90s. Bison are probably one of the greatest conservation stories in the history of the United States. Grizzly bears are delisted. We'll see what happens in the courts this week, whether or not they'll be relisted or stay delisted, and how we move forward. But those are active discussions that we're always in with the states, with stakeholder groups and organizations, and I think I can say without fear of contradiction that in Yellowstone National Park we will stand up for the resources of the park. We will do what's right and take the position of what's right for the long-term preservation of Yellowstone and the entire ecosystem.
So you feel that the law is pretty clear, and that Secretary Zinke's letter from earlier this month about lining the parks or aligning the parks' wildlife policies more with state wildlife hunting policies doesn't apply to Yellowstone?
I think that his letter applies to Yellowstone in one way, and I think we are aligned, and that is there are parks in the national park system. I think there's about under 70, it might be 67 or 69, I'm sorry, I don't remember, that their legislation allows for hunting in those parks. Our legislation allows for fishing in the park. And so what we looked at, or what we're looking at, is how do our regulations around fishing and fishing permits that we give, how do they align with the states of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana? Now, we think we're in alignment with those regulations and policies, but it's not his email was not about allowing hunting in Yellowstone National Park and allowing things that are not currently allowed within the park. I'm very confident that is not what that memo or that email was trying to do.
I think it's really interesting. I think people forget that you have your Yellowstone National Park bumped up against 3 states. That is an interesting thing that you have to manage here all the time. It is a different deal, and none of those 3 states are not the same. Very few national parks have to do that. Maybe Four Corners gets 4 of them, but the rest of them don't quite have that kind of jurisdictional challenge.
Well, certainly wildlife do not respect political boundaries. And so we're dealing with 3 states, and primarily it's Wyoming and Montana. So over 60% of Yellowstone is in the state of Wyoming. The next highest is Montana, and then Idaho has a sliver. But we work very closely with both Montana and Wyoming when we talk about what are the quotas, or what are we going to do about wolf hunting, in the hunting units throughout the park. And every year you probably report on that the Montana Wildlife Commission has made a determination on what's going to be allowed to be hunted in outside of the boundaries on the north side. The same thing happens in Wyoming. We react with a wildlife biologist in the states. We react with each of the states' commissions. And I think we have a really good relationship. And I think everyone does have the same goal, is what do we need to do to protect and to make sure we have that population of wolves, that population ultimately of grizzly bears. What do we have to do to make sure they're managed the most effectively? Because it's also about, I'll use grizzly bears as my example. depending on how you count with grizzly bears, and the current method is used by the Yellowstone Grizzly Coordinating Committee is something called Chow 2, which says there's about 725 bears within something called the designated monitoring area. How many bears can be taken by the states and what hunting units affects more than just the conservation or the sportsman in terms of taking bears. It also affects visitor experience. A lot of people come to Yellowstone National Park to see a grizzly bear. This is probably the greatest opportunity they have in the lower 48 to have a reliable chance to see a grizzly bear in its natural element. The same is for wolves. Therefore, it has to be about more than just how many bears or how many wolves or how many elk or whatever can be harvested. There's a visitor experience part of that I would say has a far, far greater economic impact on the 3 states than harvesting a few grizzly bears or harvesting a few wolves. And I like to believe that is being considered by state agencies when they consider how they're going to hunt and where they're going to hunt.
We're getting close to the end here, but I did want to go one other place. You're leaving this week, at the end of this week. You will be retired by the time this airs. Earlier than you had said you intended to leave. Do you feel like things were manipulated in Washington, D.C. or at other higher levels of the Park Service to have you leave earlier than you wished?
Absolutely. I think it's, I had, before it was rumored, I was informed that I was going to be transferred or reassigned to Washington, D.C. I had made my feelings known for a long time that I intended to retire from Yellowstone National Park. When I could not get a conversation with my bosses or the Department of Interior about a gracious transition in terms of my departure, things that needed to be finished and bringing the next person. I announced my retirement for the end of the first quarter of 2019. After I announced my retirement, they made a decision to reassign me in any event, knowing I was going to retire. So it's nothing I'm upset about. We also have people in South Dakota, or excuse me, that's where I'm going. We also have people in Montana who have who basically taken credit for my ouster in terms of former state legislators who've said they've gone to the secretary and asked for my removal. I have no idea if that's accurate or not. So I have certainly it's not normal.
Quick last question before we wrap this up, Dan. You've been an advocate for Yellowstone National Park, not just the superintendent. Does that end? Are you done?
No. I've told people when I came back to Yellowstone now almost 8 years ago, it was like coming home. Yellowstone grabs you. It's always going to be part of my life. I intend to continue to be a strong advocate for Yellowstone. I'm going to take a little time to get my bearings, but you may not see my name or hear my voice, but I'm going to be working on behalf of Yellowstone, I'm sure, for the rest of my life.
That's perfect. Again, Dan Wenk, now as this airs, former superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, joining us this morning on Face the State. Dan, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
On behalf of John Shear, I am Chet Lehman, and thank you for joining us on Face the State. Have yourself a pleasant Sunday.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.